Hi there, it's Roz, and this is one of my kind of pair of videos today, because the other one was celebrating 6 months and on BookTube as a channel and 500 subscribers, hence the bunting. But in that video, I said that I've made a plan to start a new style of kind of like monthly video that's a bit of a wrap up, and that I'm calling D&D Discoveries and Delights, with the odd disappointment thrown in if there've been any in my month's reading, which, you know, I try and keep my disappointments to the minimum, but I've got a couple this month. So June. How was June? Well, I read 13 different books or things in June, which is slightly more than I usually would. You know, it's an unusually high number, I guess, for a month. And one of the reasons for that is that 3 of those were collections of poetry and one of them was a play. And they tend to be like shorter, faster as a rule. So yeah, that probably explains why it hit 13. And so there were 7 novels and 1 memoir, and 3 collections of poetry, 1 play, and 1 collection of short stories. I'm not wild about short stories, but I really enjoyed this collection because it was really good fun and related to Caribathon, of which more later. Yeah. So now, about a month ago, I was watching a video by on the channel Artisan Geek, which is just like such a good channel if you don't already watch it, but you probably already do. You don't need me to tell you that. Anyway, she was talking about how she had started to count how many books that she reads by black authors, as part of, like, that a while back she'd realised that, like, here she was as a black woman mostly reading books by white men, or certainly by white people, and how daft that was. And so she just started counting to shift that, and I completely recognised what she meant, because about maybe 10 years ago, slightly less maybe, I realised that I was reading more books by men than by women, and that seemed a bit odd to me. And I just started keeping a tally of male and female authors, and just by doing that and without really thinking about it, I switched the balance, so I was reading more women than men, which is kind of where I guess I want it to be. I mean, I want to read both, but that's where I want it to be. So I really understood what she meant, and that made me go and kind of do a couple more stats on my reading for June, because she'd put this into my head. And so 7 of the authors that I read this month were writers of colour, shall we say. And one of them I read more than 1 book by, but yeah, seven writers of colour out of those I read this month. And 8 of the authors that I read were not from the UK where I live, that's a kind of mix that I'm comfy with. That works for me. You will also know, if you watch this channel, that one of the things that I deliberately try and do each month is read at least 1 book by an author that is from a country where I have never read a book from that country before. Oh, it's a very long-winded way of explaining that, but you know what I mean. And this month I actually got in 3. So my planned one was The Ultimate Tragedy by Abdulai Sila from Guinea-Bissau, and I did a video about that, so I won't talk about it here, but it was interesting. Good. And but then I came across Caribathon, and that got me off looking for books from the independent islands of the Caribbean, as instructed by our Caribathon leaders, as it were, Karen and Peter. And so I got 2 more new countries out of that, St Vincent and the Grenadines and the Bahamas. So thank you to them, and that was fun, and I look forward to Caribathon next year again. Now, when I was reading things for Caribathon, one of the things that kind of reminded me to do, or led me into doing, was looking for, thinking about the connection between Britain and the Caribbean, and reading UK-based writers of Caribbean heritage, to kind of explore that a bit. And that brings me to my first enormous delight and recommendation this month, which was A Portable Paradise by Roger Robinson. Now, if you read poetry, please read that book. It's it's a new collection, and I really couldn't recommend it more strongly. So that's number one of my month's delights. Another of my really special discoveries and delights this month was the play that I read with Tilly for our Discussing Drama habit series, and that was Translations by Brian Friel. Now Brian Friel was not a complete discovery to me because I have watched one of his plays before, but I've never read any, and Tilly was so right to get us to do that play. And what was interesting, I guess, in reading that around the same time that I was reading a couple of books by people, 3 in fact, or 4 even, by people from countries that were part of the British Empire historically, and kind of perhaps spoke to something of that history and experience, was that, of course, Translations by Brian Friel, it was very much thinking about the English behaviour in Ireland, and of course Ireland was in effect our first colony. I like, it's where Britain almost practiced our bad behaviour as an imperial power in Ireland. So yeah, that gave an extra sort of interesting twist to my thinking about that this month. So that's two top recommendations this month. One poetry, one play. One of my disappointments this month was one of the things that I read for Caribathon, and that was the memoir that I read, Life on a Rock by Kate Aubrey. And I talked about that in a Scallydandling video, so I won't go on about that here. But my other disappointment, and disappointment is perhaps too strong a word for this, was I read The Watchmaker of Filigree Street by Natasha Pulley, and that book had been so enthusiastically recommended by Katie of Books and Things and others that I was kind of really anticipating it with a lot of pleasure, and it was good. It was a good book. I liked the structure, I liked the characters, there was lots about it I liked, but yet it was just not quite the really special 5-star book that I wanted it to be. And that's a problem, isn't it, when you've kind of got something kind of a bit hyped up in your mind and then it's just not quite as good as you thought, that it's unfair on the book because it winds up being a disappointment. Whereas if I'd come across that book having not heard anything about it before and discovered it for myself, it probably would have been one of the ones that I was really enthusing about this month. That's funny, isn't it? Aren't we strange like that? Or aren't I strange like that? I won't accuse you of that sort of perverse way of thinking. So that was one of 4 books that I read this month, based on someone else's recommendation. And another of them was 16 Trees of the Somme by Lars Mytting, and that was a bestseller in Norway. It was recommended to me by a friend who's half Norwegian. In fact, she lent me the copy. She was so keen that I should read it, and it's a really good story, interesting structure, really enjoyed it. It goes back to the First World War, the Second World War, the whole kind of Norway's sort of the sort of legacy of particularly World War II for Norway is an interesting one that I won't go into here, but yeah, it's some things haven't been fully put to bed in a way, I suppose. My disappointment about that book, okay, is the writer writes good men, but his female characters, like whenever he introduces a new female character, he just seems to feel the need to tell me, the reader, what kind of breasts she has. You know, are they like big and bouncy or small and pert, or, you know, it's like, oh, for goodness sake, you know, why do male writers do that? Why? You know, can anyone explain that to me? It's just irritating. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it is just plain irritating. Yeah. So that would be my only reason for disrecommending 16 Trees of the Somme, which is in other respects a very good book, I think. Very moving in places. Next novel that I read based on a recommendation was Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. Now, which is a book that is recommended to me by my son Alfred, who reads a lot more fantasy than I do. In fact, it's kind of like the majority of what he reads, and I sometimes kind of try and tempt him out of it into other areas. But that's what he loves, and he recommended it to me and said it was one that he thought I might enjoy. And I made sure I read it in June because June is Pride Month, and I just wanted to make sure that I consciously chose at least one book to read this month by an LGBTQ author, and so Fifth Season was it. And that was a winner for me. Now, often I have a problem with fantasy around the world building that you usually get at the beginning of a fantasy book, and I can find that a bit tiresome. Don't tell Alfred. No, he knows because I've said that to him many times. And I have to get beyond that before I start to really enjoy the book, because it's not the bit that I really love. But I did with Fifth Season, and I thought it was a really good and interesting novel, and I know it's one that a number of other people out there have enjoyed, and I know a few booktubers that I think are now reading the third book in the trilogy, so I'll have to try and read those and catch up. I'm not very good about remembering to read sequels and trilogies. It's not one of my strengths. It's because I'm a bit of a flibbity gibbet, I think. You know, I read one book and think, oh, I've done that author now. Not quite, but it's a bit like that. Yeah. But I will get to them. The other thing that I read that was based on a recommendation was Citizen by Claudia Rankine, which is a kind of a collection of poetry, except that it's yes, a little bit more to it than that. It's kind of a bit of a multimedia experience. I talked about it in another video, the Amplify Voices video, and the person who recommended that to me was another booktuber, and that was Mark Nash, and he doesn't read loads of poetry, but if he reads one and says it's good, then I go and search it out. So yeah, that was another of the month's highlights and a new author for me, so another discovery, and another book that I'd urge you to read rather than just say, oh, you might enjoy that. Like, I urge you to read Citizen. What were the month's top novels for me then? Okay, so 2, and one is a bit of a Marmite book. That's Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. Now, I can't believe that I haven't read a book by Bernardine Evaristo before, and I'm really glad that I read this one. And not everyone loves that book, but I did. It just hit the right note for me, and I've talked about it in another video, because I think it's partly about my psychological context. So it was the right timing for me to read that book, and things about that book that might have annoyed me didn't, because of the context in which I was reading it. So I was interested in how, as readers, we interact with what we read. But my absolute top novel of this month was not a discovery, it was a reread, and I am not a big rereader. I read, apart from Jane Austen, I rarely reread things, but I was inspired to reread this because Steve, my husband, read it because I'd said to him, oh, have you not read that? Oh, you must read that, you'd like it. He had such fun reading it that I thought, God, I've just got to pick it up and read it again. And that was Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons, and that is my other top delight, top recommendation for this month. If you like reading books that are funny and clever and warm and generous spirited, and have a really strong sense of place, then and you haven't read Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons, then read that. yeah, make that something you read. My other kind of type of discovery I wanted to kind of throw in to these videos is discoveries of other booktubers, and I have some booktubers who, you know, I share with and talk to, and always watch. People like Hannah and Alba Seriella, and yeah, others I've mentioned today, and Kelly of Books I'm Not Reading, and Peg of the History Shelf. Even people who don't necessarily read the sort of thing I read a lot, like Peg. You know, I really enjoy their channels. But it's always nice when you come across kind of a new one to connect with. And this month, I kind of got to know the two booktubers who were running Caribathon, and they were both new to me, and that's their channels are Run Right Reads and Cozy Comfy Up, and Comfy Cozy Up. Get that right. I always get that the wrong way around. It's a lovely channel. So that was great. And two kind of like newer booktubers that I guess I'm giving a shout out for. Yeah, am I in a position to give people a shout out? They might even have more people watching them than I do. But one is Karen Evans, who literally is really new to booktube, and is worth a look for sure. And the other is Will of the Book Barrel, and I think that he started his channel at the very end of May, and it's flourishing already, so that is lovely. So that was my this month's delights. One disappointment, one semi-disappointment, a couple of discoveries, and a really great month. I'll do this again in July.